officially day 3 of the 2017 31 Days of Horror-Ween countdown, and today we find ourselves in the 1920s, and we're going across the pond all the way to Sweden with a film called The Phantom Carriage from 1921, and it's a very important film, certainly in the history of Swedish cinema. I mean, without this movie, we probably wouldn't even have like the Ingmar Bergman filmography. It was a huge, huge influence on him, as obviously you see in a lot of his later works. In fact, the director of this movie is a guy named Victor Sjöström, and he actually played the main character in Wild Strawberries, the professor, in the movie that Bergman made a couple years later. So obviously, it's a big, big movie in the pantheon of continental European genre cinema. And it's one of those movies where now we're starting to kind of see the genre sort of diverge from what it's been doing. You go back and you watch the first 2 movies in our countdown, you watch J'accuse and you watch Student of Prague. They're more or less basic, straight-up melodramas, more or less morality plays more than anything else, with maybe like one sort of supernatural hook working as a plot mechanic. So I mean, they had sort of some creepy, eerie, otherworldly stuff going on, but that wasn't necessarily the focus of the movie. Like, it was more on the plot, and this had that kind of going on in the background to keep the narrative going. Well, with The Phantom Carriage, we're seeing sort of a change here, because now, instead of having the supernatural stuff as something in the background, basically as narrative glue, it's becoming the focal point of the movie. And we're seeing this, and you'll see it later on with a couple more movies, how the genre shifts away from being basic melodrama and reality plays to actually being more focused on just the supernatural and creepy otherworldly stuff happening, all this metaphysical junk, and people just reacting to it. So now we're starting to kind of see the movies become the horror genre that we all know and love. So it's kind of important in there to kind of see it as a transitional point. So there's that. Alright, so as for the plot, it's a movie that starts off, and it's, I'm assuming it's set in Sweden. It doesn't explicitly say it, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it is. And it's on New Year's Eve, and there's this woman who is dying, and she's about to buy the farm, and all she can think about is her old bed buddy David. And David, he's still out there, and this is actually pretty interesting because it has sort of like a dueling narrative going back and forth. Again, you got to remember, the idea of feature film, still, even in 1921, not exactly that familiar of a concept. So it's telling her story, it's also telling his story, and it's going back and forth with 2 characters, which was pretty, not going to say it's 100% revolutionary, but certainly not a common practice like it is today. So we go find David, and he's like this dude who works as, a grave digger, and he's out there and he's drunk with his 2 buddies, and they start telling a story about this, what I'm assuming to be a Swedish tradition, that the last person who dies every year basically becomes the new Grim Reaper. So he gets drunk, and they get into a fight, and he gets knocked out. And when he gets knocked out, and this is David, his body jumps out of his soul, and he's confronted by the Grim Reaper. And the Grim Reaper in this movie is epitomized by this dude in a beard who has a hood on. And he's actually the manifestation of one of David's old friends, a guy named George. Or George is, but, we're American, we're going to Anglicanize it as George, who apparently was a guy who died on New Year's Eve a couple of years back. So basically what we're seeing here is the movie, it's about him passing the torch. It's about this guy who's being basically trained to be the new Grim Reaper. And ironically enough, is his old friend, so you have that plot dynamic going on. Pretty interesting stuff, pretty complex material for the silent film era, especially 1921. This stuff wasn't really that commonplace. So eventually he shows him around, and the way the Grim Reaper is shown, he rides along on this, I'm trying to say the best way to put it. It's kind of a sled, but not really. It's a carriage, well obviously the Phantom Carriage, I mean that's what it's called. But it's kind of hard to describe what it looks like. You have to see it for yourself. But it does have horses, and they're carrying them around. But the way the Grim Reaper is filmed is only like half-exposed film. So you can kind of see him. He's translucent, but not quite really. And we see him basically riding over the ocean when he's introduced. And it's a really, really cool shot. it's the kind of thing where, like, even now, it's pretty jarring. So I can only imagine people back in 1920 must have been freaking out when they saw that. So anyway, from there on, it gets pretty complex with the plot. Basically, you kind of saw the twist coming here. That David, he's the new Grim Reaper, and basically because he's the new Grim Reaper, he's got to kill, the last person on New Year's Eve. And what do you know? It's his old buddy, his old lover named Edith. Actually, it's Edith. If you look at the subtitles, we're gonna call her Edith because, once again, we Anglicanize everything. So he's got to, put up with that, and he's got to figure out whether or not he's able to go through with it. And it just kind of starts to slow down after the first hour. I mean, the first hour is really, really good, but then it starts just getting inundated with subplots. And eventually, there is kind of a twist ending. This might be, I'm not sure if it's the first major twist ending in a horror film, but it's something we've seen a billion times before, or certainly subsequent to this one. It's where the entire thing has a really big twist ending where you think the guy's dead, but he's actually not. So it's like an inverted Sixth Sense scenario going on. So the entire movie is basically this guy knocked out in a grave trying to figure out, how to get his life back together. So again, if you look at all that from start to finish, I mean, it's still not really technically a horror film. It's still basically a character drama. Not as much of a morality play, even though it basically is sort of like a metaphor for an alcoholic, because that's the whole reason the guy's in trouble is because he won't stop drinking. It's about him getting clean. So it kind of has that subtext to it. But again, the supernatural elements, it's incorporated into the mainstream narrative, but it's still not meant to like freak you out. It's more or less the story of a guy who gets put in a really extreme circumstance and having to kind of deal with it and to kind of become more introspective about what he's doing in his life. So, I mean, yeah, it is pretty much pre-Bergman. It's all existential. It's all, about people trying to, figure out what's going on in the world, what is reality, feeling guilt and managing with that and dealing with all these interpersonal relationships. So yeah, if you're a fan of Bergman movies, definitely need to check this out because it had a huge, profound influence on him. And if you're a fan of horror films, it's worth seeing just to kind of see the characterization of the Grim Reaper, one of the earlier embodiments of death in the annals of film. So overall, I mean, you need to watch it because it's historically important. The special effects are pretty good. I mean, the plot, give or take. I mean, the first hour is good, but after that it really starts to drag, and the ending is kind of it's kind of a crapper of an ending. But overall, it's pretty enjoyable. Using my patented rating system, I'm going to give it 2.5 tofu dogs out of 4. So it's a historically important movie, but with so many films alike, even though you really appreciate it, admire its impact and contribution to the genre, it doesn't really hold up that well. I mean, it's a film that, has some good moments. The aesthetics are cool. There's a decent story there. I like the way they kind of weave the narratives, the two characters in and out. But on the whole, there's better from this time period. I mean, it's not exactly, D.W. Griffin's Intolerance. Let's put it that way. It's not The Crowd. There are better films with better characterization than this. But just for being one of the first movies to kind of incorporate that supernatural hook and giving us a pretty good embodiment of death, which, of course, is the staple of all horror films moving forward, it's worth checking out. Alright, so that's the Phantom Carriage. That's the end of day 3. And day 4, we're going to stick to the 1920s, and we're going to keep the international cinema theme going, this time with a very, very underrated and inventive psychological thriller from Japan. So, stay tuned for that. You're going to like it.